We have presentations today from Lisa Roux, and then we will have a response and question and answer session as usual. The timing for the session, again, if you haven't been before, is about 20 to 25 minutes for the main presentation, 10 minutes for the response, and then hopefully plenty of time left for question and answer at the very end. So I think without further ado, I might hand over to Lisa Roux from Stellenbosch University Unit of Religion and Development there. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Olivia, and thank you everyone for joining what I hope will be a conversation. So I think before diving into the paper, because you read it, I'm going to tell you a bit about where it came from, why it happened. And a big part of the story is the work that I do. So as Olivia said, I work for the Unit for Religion and Development Research at Stellenbosch University. And we do research with and for governments, FBOs, churches, development organizations, around religion, culture, and violence, and specifically gender-based violence. And I've been doing this for about 12 years. Part of that process is that you're usually working on someone else's agenda. So you're evaluating their programming or working in their planning, doing research for what they have in mind. And over the years, especially in evaluating violence against women and girls, VOG, prevention programming, a key theme that emerged is this issue of women's complicity. So we would see in different ways how women are complicit, and I know it's a very sensitive term, in the violence being perpetrated in the home, but also kind of supporting that narrative that allows for unequal power dynamics within the household and justifies the violence perpetrated against them. And as so much of the work that I do is within religious spaces, different religion, but usually Christianity, this was a key thing coming up repeatedly, but then so often with the organizations that I do work with, this is the part of the report that they want cut, when they get the draft, or that they just completely ignore in some other way. And it's very often a really uncomfortable discussion, if the discussion is even had. So the second part of 2018, I was a visiting fellow at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton in a seminar called on religion and violence. And this gave me the opportunity this is what I proposed doing while I was there, is to dig into this issue a bit more, because I constantly see this in the empirical work that I'm doing, but I wanted to read more. I never had time to read what other people have been writing around this and just kind of make more sense around it, a sense about it. And just, yes. So this paper was kind of an attempt to engage with what I've seen in practice, but to look more at the theory behind it, because people have been working on this. This isn't, clearly, it's not just me. So that's why I ended up writing this paper, and the process of actually having the time. I don't know what each of you do. I know some of you, but you rarely have time to really read enough and read everything that you want. And this was actually the first time in my life that I had this opportunity. Usually it's just like these really strict deadlines and, funding is running out, so they need the evaluation done. To have time to really read what people have been writing and to think about it and to put it together. And in the process, I was challenged because I was kind of entering it thinking, okay, so I need a handle on understanding women's complicity, religious women's complicity. And what I found and what I hope is captured in this paper is that complicity itself isn't as simple as I thought it was. Yes, so the reason I chose this paper for the reading group is because I think it's relevant to researchers and practitioners. I think it's good for all of us every now and then to be forced to think about our own positioning and the lens that we use when we engage with others and when we do research and when we design programming. And to, I mean, we know we should, and I think often we do, but especially, at least for me, with a feminist lens that I this was a good reminder for me. Yes. So, and it's not always fun, I think, to maybe take that step back and start thinking about how am I thinking and how's that influencing my research? Okay, so with that long background, let me just start talking a bit more about the paper. So the original purpose of the paper was to offer a reflection on this reality of religious women's complicity in Vogue, Violence Against Women and Girls, Vogue. But as I said, with the reading I did, I think, and I hope it became more nuanced than that it really became more of a reflection on this tension between complicity and agency, and the reality of the biases that may cause misunderstanding of religious women's agency. So in that way, the paper challenged me in writing it, but even now when I had to read it again in preparing for this presentation, because I think it demands that we as researchers and practitioners have a much lighter touch and much more openness when engaging with Vogue and with religious women. And it demands like a really conscious attempt to suspend your own strongly held beliefs in the process of trying to understand what's actually going on. Yeah. So to give you a brief overview, I'm not going to touch on everything, but just kind of light touches on key points. So the reality of women's complicity in Vogue, but also encountering women's empowerment gains and gender equality interventions, it has been explained in different ways, and really there is writing on it. I don't think it's as mainstream, and especially not within Vogue literature, but there is writing on it, and generally it's explained. So just generally, women's complicity in violence against women and girls, as they have no freedom to oppose it. So they're absolutely powerless. The patriarchal system is so all-encompassing, they can't oppose it in any way. The second explanation is this false consciousness idea. They don't oppose their subjugation because they're not aware of it. Now, the term false consciousness is not PC anymore, but you kind of still see it written, just using nicer words very often. If you knew better, you would oppose, kind of thing. The third is patriarchal bargaining. So it's this idea that, yes, I'm aware of the ways that I'm being subjugated, but it's worthwhile because there are certain advantages or benefits to it. And then the fourth explanation is that this compliance is actually fake. So it's limited or it's fake. Actually, women have a secret underlying plan where they're free and they're just kind of faking this compliance. So that's how generally complicity is usually explained. But if we specifically look at religious women's complicity, the one reason why religious women are said to be okay with this, with their subjugation by their religion and religious community, is that it's a fair bargain for them. So they might be restricted by their religion in certain ways, but it gives them freedom in other ways from other restrictions. Then second explanation is that they're actually just using religion. It's a strategic approach. So yeah, let me not go into detail with that. And then the third one is this idea that they don't actually comply, that they subvert and adapt and resist in various ways, but people just don't see it. They don't recognize that resistance and agency. But if you start looking at all of these explanations and what's been written on it, what they have in common is that it explains religious women and women in general as well, their actions only within this idea of resistance or compliance to patriarchy. So patriarchy is the framework, and everything you do can only be understood in this binary, resistance or compliance. It's the only lens, it's the only framing. And that's typical of feminism, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I think patriarchal lens is an important lens to use in your work, and it's a very real. Sorry, someone needs to. So most feminist analysis focuses on identifying the moments and modalities of resistance to domination. So agency is then only seen as this ability to achieve your own interest, despite the pressure of custom or traditional religion. So agency is just about opposing custom or tradition or religion. And as you've hopefully read, this is because feminism has a dual agenda. So the one is the analytical agenda, where it strives to understand and diagnose women's status and condition, and then the political agenda, where it prescribes what should be done to bring change to women's status and condition. And what I argue is that both in our research, and I'm very guilty of this, so this was a very, I think a very honest article in terms of where I was identifying my own weaknesses as a researcher and in my own positioning. But I think this is also true for praxis, for practitioners. We often collapse those two agendas. So in the process of trying to understand the situation, we only use that lens of what should be. We only look at the resistance and the compliance. We're already wearing our political hats, where we should, at that point, only be using our analytical spectacles, you know? So in exploring this, I do have to highlight, we're super indebted to Islamic feminist scholars for the work being done on this. It's almost exclusively Islamic feminist scholars that have been writing on this issue. And I think if you think about it, it's quite logical, because this idea of the Muslim woman is such a this idea of how she is subjugated by her religion. So I think from in that space, as Islamic feminist scholars, there was this need to explain why it's not that simplistic a picture. So I'm very indebted to the work done by these scholars. So because, yeah, anyway. So for me, this is the first challenge that the paper offers researchers and practitioners, is that we all say we're going in objectively, or as close as we can get to that, but you know, we are allowing the local context to lead. We're respectful of the local. And I mean, I say that as well, and I try to be that as well. But if I speak for myself, at least, my feminist political hat is a difficult one to leave behind. So I can be very intentional. So for example, to try and identify my own racial or class biases when I enter a research space, or my educational biases. When it comes to my feminist interpretations of gender relations, I find it very difficult to let my political hat go. And I'm often quite defensive if someone calls me out on this, or if I realize it about myself, because I'd be like, you know, but this is why I'm here. This is, you know, to help women. This is the right way of looking at the issue, and this clearly has to change. Increasingly, I'm realizing that if you're already with that political, in your research, I think in your engagement with the community as a practitioner, you're never going to get to the heart of why things are the way they are, specifically around the religious motivations for religious women. Now, obviously, you can't totally separate the analytical and the political. I think that's the same thing as the myth of the objective researcher. But I do think we can be much more intentional about how we engage to learn about the local context, to understand why women do and think what they do and think, to really kind of try and wear their lenses. And that means to allow for the possibility that religious women's actions can be driven by something other than resistance or compliance to patriarchy. And not to only analyze their actions in terms of resistance or oppressions, but to consciously strive to identify their frames of reference. And this is hard, but I think the major motivation for doing this, and especially for practitioners, is that I think that's key to designing appropriate interventions. If you're not correctly understanding, adequately understanding what is the drivers between certain harmful practices or beliefs, you're going to be designing ineffective interventions. So maybe just two short examples. The one example, I think it's in the paper as well, is on research that we did around child marriage, where the reason mothers were complying, were letting their 11-year-old children, girl children, enter into child marriages, was because they truly believed that this was a prerequisite for eternal salvation, both for them as parents, but for the girl as well. So an intervention that's all about women's rights and girl child education, and not addressing that fundamental driver for why people are entering their children into child marriages, is not going to be effective. And another example will be from research that we did in Uganda, and there was resistance to, it was a religion and Borg intervention, and they were doing a lot around gender equality and how joint decision making in the household, especially between spouses, and joint ownership of resources, including money. And there was so much resistance from women to this. So this isn't a religious specific example, it's just a different example. There was a lot of resistance from women to it, and people were implementing, were like, but why? See, typical, they're so blinded by the patriarchy. But then digging into it more, in that specific culture was the belief and practice that all of the money that a woman earns belongs to her, and she can decide what it's spent on. And this was an incredibly important safeguard for her and for her children in cases where husbands don't provide, which is super common. So that's why there was the resistance. But if you don't take the time to really dig down, you're going to miss it. And your intervention, if it just keeps on pushing this idea of pooling all money and sharing it out, will actually leave women more vulnerable. But for me, a crucial point is to allow for a more honest analytical project, to really, almost lay down your guard in this process of trying to understand the context, does not mean that you have to let go of your political project. Just because you're working to understand what's going on, doesn't, and to respect what's going on, it doesn't mean you can't have a vision for a safer future for women and for girls. So there's a tension, yes, but it's not two separate agendas. So I again, to give an example, so if a religious woman is regularly beaten and abused by her husband, but she suffers in silence, she doesn't report, she doesn't access support services, and then she marries off a 13-year-old girl child to an older man, and her daughter's experiencing that same violence. So me looking at this is like, look at that mother, so complicit in this patriarchal system. Look what she does. She's just accepting her suffering and allowing that for her daughter as well. And I may say that it is because she's just completely unaware that that women have rights and that this isn't okay. And then I go and design an intervention that's creating awareness about women's rights and support services and relevant laws, for example. But if I took the time to really engage and let go of my biases, my feminist political project, and looking at that situation and just being horrified, I would learn maybe that she's quoting the Bible in justifying all her decisions. So for her, this truly is a religious imperative. The Bible says she must submit to her husband, that her husband is her master, that she must persevere, that she'll have a reward in heaven. And we know the Bible says all those things. So, but now, political project, that doesn't mean now I'm just all culturally relativist. Her Bible says that, so now I can't oppose that. Now we can't transform that. I think it by recognizing and acknowledging that act of religious agency, we also recognize and acknowledge that that's the space of intervention. I'm taking her religious agency seriously and the value and authority that she places in the sacred text by designing interventions, for example, that facilitate alternative interpretations of biblical texts. Now, this is a simplistic example or a simple example, but what I'm trying to illustrate is by taking the analytical process of project seriously, so not blindly assuming complicity, I'm able to recognize the agency of religious women and then in the process design more appropriate and hopefully effective interventions. It does also mean, so my example illustrated one side of it, but it might also mean that the analytical project will get you to a point where you realize I'm not engaging on this. This isn't something that we need to transform. And I think the Islamic woman's veil is the typical issue that we see in this regard, where there's a knee-jerk response, I think, globally that, oh, it's a sign of subjugation. But in many religious spaces, if you engage with Islamic women, it isn't for them. It's a very, very marked act of agency. I know this is for many a very sensitive example, but I'm trying to illustrate that taking the analytical project seriously does sometimes mean that you're not going to take your intervention in the direction that you originally thought, because taking it seriously means also respecting what you learn. Oh goodness, okay, I'll be done. Almost done. Where am I at? Okay, so it also, taking this analytical and political dual nature of it seriously also doesn't mean that you won't find spaces where there is patriarchal bargaining or false consciousness or those other reasons offered by theorists. Sometimes women simply just don't know that there are other options available. But I think the challenge for us is to not just blindly assume that that's the situation. And I'm not saying this kind of approach will always be easy, and I think the Zambian case study in the paper illustrates it. I think it's much easier to do research, and I think also intervention work, if your political agenda leads you, I think it gives you energy and power, whereas taking the analytical project seriously means, I won't say less powerful, but I think there are power dynamics present there that get cancelled, which I think is great for the community that you work with, but might make it more difficult for you yourself to be so self-reflexive and nuanced. So yes, I'm not sure if I still have time, but maybe to just end with, I think this is where the paper challenges us, or me at least, is to be more okay with gray. So for me, as my own personal person, gender inequality and Vogue, those are black and white issues. Like, it's wrong, it must be eradicated. I get furious when I'm confronted with the consequences of it in religious communities, the harm that it causes. So like it's a helpless anger, but for me to be of value as a researcher and a person that assists practitioners, I can't be led by that righteous sense of anger, by my political agenda and what it hopes to achieve. That can't be the lens or the framing that I enter communities with. And I think to be aware of those, two different hats, the lens and the hat, maybe analytical lens, political hat, is to be energized and driven by your political hat, but to be honest and present and open by wearing that analytical hat that makes you receptive to why specific religious women are doing what they're doing. So I think maybe recognizing this dual nature is a way of making us much more empathetic in our research, which I think is a good thing. And I think I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah, I love to hear this and think that it's really the legacy of Sabah Mahmood and a lot of what she wrote and how we can now apply that in our practical everyday work in gender, religion and development research. And I think a lot of us on the call are very sympathetic and want to learn and discuss more about how we bring this complexity into some of our everyday work. So we're now going to pass over to our respondent, Najah Almugahed, who's from the Islamic Relief Worldwide and Agenda Officer. So Najah, I hope that you might speak a little bit more to this, how we practically apply this, but of course up to you. So yes, over to you for about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Olivia and Lisa. I definitely enjoyed reading the article and enjoyed that provocative discussion and questions, and I might end up adding more questions to the discussion. So looking forward to that. And I'm glad that we all share the same struggles in one way or another. It makes us feel at ease that we are all in the same space in one way or another. This article spoke to me personally from many different dimensions, being a Muslim myself, a feminist, and a practitioner in using the article's language, the international development circles. So if I can dissect that over the next few minutes, and maybe we can take it from there, working with Islamic Relief, a faith-based organization, as a gender inclusion and protection advisor means that I get to face all those questions in my day-to-day work within this organization. As a Muslim myself, or a person of faith or religion, depending on how people use different terminologies or how they would like to identify themselves, one of the main messages that I came out with is exactly what Lisa just mentioned around positionality. And being a Muslim does not mean that I, in any shape or form, represent the 1.2 billion Muslims around the world with their diverse interpretations of religion and culture. In many circumstances, I am being the researcher means that I do not really understand what's happening in that specific context. As much as we try to bring the research findings closer to reality by recruiting researchers from the same religion, give or take, we are different as individuals. And using the sector's language around that difference is usually referred to as intersectionality, or being conscious of our own intersectional identity, our own drivers that shapes our positions and our worldview. What we try to do within Islamic Relief is not doing just the traditional gender analysis, wearing my practitioner hat on. We're trying to introduce what we call the intersectional framework, through which, when we do the traditional gender analysis, we add elements around age, disability inclusion, ethnicity, or any other excluding factor, so that our gender analysis, where we try to find more about those differentiated needs at a community level, is more reflective to reality. And I think that's the element that was advocating for throughout this article, is differentiating between the political and analytical hat. We are, as an NGO, come with some of our political agendas putting forward, but only if we do that intersectional analysis, if we try to dig deeper and understand the different analytical frameworks that the communities we work with come from, enables us to differentiate their needs. And I think that framework is what we're trying, or what we're striving to do within a faith-based organization. It provides that room for distinction between gender, religion, and culture, as those are deeply intertwined sources of influence for our own beliefs and obviously our actions. As a Muslim feminist, I've asked myself that question a lot, if the two are contradictory by nature or not. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of articles that has been written around that, and lines of anthropology that shows the overlapping identities of both. But I think that there is an equal responsibility on both feminist and religious scholars to find that middle ground. There is a beautiful saying for Rumi, which goes like, out beyond the wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field, and I'll meet you there. Experiencing that field, or exploring it and visiting and revisiting text and verses of the Holy Quran, or sayings of our Prophet Muhammad, or elements in religion, and trying to redefine it to what is applicable to our day and age, to the different contexts we live at, and brings us back to our main or core values as Muslims, which is social justice, is something that we as a faith-based organization try to do within our work around gender equality and prevention against violence against women and girls. So we work mainly with Muslim scholars to revisit that text, to recognize obviously their power and authority within the communities we serve. And they are sometimes considered the gatekeepers for any cultural or attitudinal change. So working with them actually enriches the conversation and creates that change at a community level. If I can just reflect on one of the examples from the work that we're doing within Islamic Relief and in partnership with World Vision, is adapting what we call the Channels of Hope methodology. It's a methodology where we work with faith leaders and their spouses, which is referred to in this article as religious women. So we engage with them in different conversations and workshops, and try to build that momentum so that they themselves are the advocates or the leaders or the champions for change and prevention against gender-based violence or child abuse. And we are aware of our role and our position as a faith-based organization. Our role is mainly to provide the necessary tools and resources to facilitate the discussion, whereas change or sustainability of those discussions are happening at a community level. And it's our presence is mainly just to support that discussion and to ensure that that conversation is taking place, rather than just swiping it under the carpet or only using a political lens in our humanitarian or development approach. The question that this article raised around religious women being portrayed as the holders of religious practices that is sometimes considered anti-feminist is happening, and it's true in one way or another, but who defines what feminism is, and that's why we need sometimes to revisit the definition of feminism, to broaden it up, to look at elements within feminism that maybe we, as you mentioned, Lisa, could be furious about, but at the same time, if feminism is about being pro-choice, and if that's the position, or that's where they come from, and if that's what they choose for themselves, then we should find it within us to respect and understand those choices. I'm afraid that the religious anti-feminist sentiment is usually responded to by an anti-religious secular feminism, and that does not help anyone. So I would totally agree with what was mentioned in the article around the conversation of religion or engaging in religion does not mean that we suspend all critique and desire for change. As a Muslim feminist myself, I won't and I can't allow anyone to deprive me from my identity and from my own ability to think and critique interpretations of religion without feeling that I need to somehow compromise to fit to a certain narrative or a certain definition of feminism. And breaking that stigma around feminism being anti-men is also brilliantly discussed within this article, that we need to have that open, honest conversation that the perpetrators for violence could sometimes be women as well, because in our sector, we almost always never talk about that. They're just the victims of violence. Reflecting on my position as a practitioner within the international development sphere, within within a faith-based organization as well, I've learned that words matter. Defining gender equality, feminism, or some of those conceptually terms that are very much intertwined with culture and the context that we live at within an organization that operates in 40 countries around the world, means that a lot of those conceptual terms will be conceptual if we don't translate them into activities or outcomes, or use a language that is more simplistic and understandable and digestible within the communities we work with, as well as within the international development sphere. As an organization, we've tried to somehow bring that together by having our own policies on gender justice, our position around early and forced marriage, or sexual and reproductive health, or domestic violence, or any of those controversial gender-related issues. And having those position papers helps us in having a clear position around those issues while being a faith-based and revisiting text around those issues. There is also an issue of contextualizing when it comes to gender-related programming. Every context have their own issues and their own gender-related activities that we might be working at. So as an organization, we are currently spearheading what we call the Islamic Gender Justice Declaration, where we've had a series of consultations with faith leaders, men and women, to discuss what are the priorities around gender and gender-related issues and prevention that could be prioritized in the Muslim world. And we can all have those priorities and working around those priorities, whether we are a faith-based organization or not. And hopefully we will be able to launch this declaration by the end of this year. It's taking us a while to finalize the consultations from different contexts and different angles and perspectives, but hopefully we can come together to what we call a mutual calls to action around gender equality. My very last point is about something that I read in the article, that being faith literate is currently trendy, or it's a skill that is required in our sector. And I think that for years, we have been advocating for faith to be included as an important element for designing humanitarian response and development initiatives across the globe. And we've come a long way, and faith is being currently recognized as an important element in people's lives and identities, and that could not be ignored from us as practitioners. So I think that as practitioners who are genuinely trying to create change or pursue gender equality, faith will always be an element, and having that analytical lens is essential to create that change. As a faith-based organization, we have been placed in this unique position. I'm not sure if it's intentional or coincidental, but we have been placed in this position to bridge that gap between international development organizations and faith or religious institutions. It's ironic that sometimes I see myself as not religious enough or secular enough. I'm somewhere in between, and I think that's the middle ground that Rumi referred to, and that could be challenging at times, but it's also an opportunity at most of the time. So I hope we can all find that middle ground, or what you described, Lisa, as the gray area in our lives and hearts. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Najah. So we're now open to questions. You're welcome to, because we're a small enough group, I'm just going to ask you to unmute or raise your hand. But again, likewise, if you don't want to be on the recording, please just put your question in the chat and I can read that out too. So yes, we're now open to questions from the group, or discussions or comments, or anything that you'd like to say. Yeah, Misbah.
Hi there. Just first wanted to thank both Elisabet and Najah for their amazing comments, but also Elisabet for sharing your article with us. It's just so fascinating, and a lot of my work is actually in this sort of space of trying to theorize imaginations of agency that fall between religion and complicity or conformity. So very interested in this work. A piece that I had just finished yesterday of my own that I wanted to sort of I wanted to bring in just so that I can ask my question in a way that you can understand the context and where I'm coming from. So I'm not sure if you recall, but in Mahmoud's work, she talks about these two women and how they are responding to the notions of being an unmarried single woman in Egypt. And one of them considers herself to be like a secular Muslim, and then the other one is part of like the piety movement. And one of them says, in order to survive patriarchy, one must develop this sort of self-confidence and self-empowerment. Whereas the woman within the piety movement says one must embrace this notion of sabr. And sabr is sort of, usually translated as patience, but she's sort of also seeing it as like a perseverance or endurance, right? And then what she urges us to do is, because the secular Muslim, quote unquote, said, oh, that's just an excuse for being passive. And so Mahmoud is sort of telling us, let's not cast this as being a passive form of agency, but instead really understand the active elements within what it means to embody sabr. So with that, I wanted to ask you, what are, because I know that you've sort of talked to us about complicity and what are the different ways in which complicity can be interpreted and what kind of political and what kind of power it might hold. But what I do want to know is, are there, and do you find there to be active elements of complicity? What are ways in which complicity can serve as an active form of agency? If that doesn't make sense, please let me know. But thank you so much.
Now you need to tell me, because I might be misunderstanding your questions. Because you're saying where complicity serves is actually agency. So where, what I'm understanding is you're asking examples or spaces where what is perceived as complicity with patriarchy or the patriarchal status quo is actually religious acts of agency, right? That's what you meant, Misbah?
I guess for me, I'm also trying not to necessarily think about about complicity as being not agency, right? What are ways in which, you know, what are possibilities in which, you know, abiding or being part of that system, like that we might find to be complicit, might actually be an active sort of choice, an active form of perseverance, an active form of endurance, like the way that Mahmoud is talking to us about Sabr. I'm just sort of trying to challenge these ideas of resistance and agency as not complicit. So I'm just sort of wondering if there are possibilities of sitting in that sort of tension.
So you're asking me a really hard question at the moment.
And
I miss, we have very heavy rains at the moment, so I think that affects my Wi-Fi a bit. But I guess so now I'm kind of defaulting by thinking of the research that I've done and the spaces that I've really looked at complicity, which I've never had that much of an opportunity until lately, because people aren't really comfortable with you looking at it. So one space, okay, let me maybe answer it this way. One space where I think that tension and the where there's that tension and you're almost unsure what is it that I'm seeing is very often within women's organizations or women's divisions of religious communities. So if I think like in the Anglican Church, the Mothers Union, that would be a typical example, and I've done research on this space, where you see incredibly alarming, for me, examples of what I would see complicity with patriarchy, where religious women are supporting beliefs and norms that are harmful to women and girls. But then when you start digging deeper, you would find, and I'm using this example because I did quite in-depth research around this. So where you would find, yes, examples where because a strong narrative is, I went through this when I was a young woman. Finally, I am now the one in power. So you very often see this within these women's spaces within religious communities, where they're actually not willing to give up the power that they will need to give up if transformation is allowed, because of, they suffered when they were young, now finally benefiting. But in those same spaces, so I'm going to give you an example. It was a photo voice project, and one of our research assistants took a picture of a lot of women cooking, like the dishes that they prepare, and it's just women. And I was looking at this picture before she starts explaining. I'm like, yeah, so because she was saying this is a really positive picture of the Mothers Union and what it means to them, and I'm like, yes, it's just reinforcing this idea of women in the kitchen and serving while the men are outside, and And then she started explaining this, and she explained that in their Mothers Union group, they cook food from other cultures. And this is for them a way to escape and example of religious motivation. But what I'm hoping is to illustrate, like, it needed that deeper digging down to see that, but how the same space, this women's organization, can hold both examples of genuine religious agency and examples of buying into a system that is harmful. Yeah, so did I write about this in this article? Now I feel really stupid. I explained it, sorry. Oh, I feel very silly.
We'll go on to the next question, I think.
So I hope, I find it difficult, Mr., to give a concrete example of, see, this is agency, this is complicity, because I think within the same person in the same space, you find both. And in one setting, it can be an example of agency, and in another setting, an example of complicity. Yes, I think that's where I'll leave that.
Okay, so we have 3 questions and 10 minutes. So I'll ask each person to be brief. But Mary, I've got Mary, Joan, and then Mujem. So Mary, over to you first.
Okay, I want to appreciate Elisabet for the presentation, and my other friend who made the response, Najah. Now, I just want to mention an observation. Mine is not a question. I have this observation that complacency has been cultivated in the structures of the church, of the religious systems. For example, like in my denomination and locality, the structures of the church has taught the systems and the doctrinal teachings that women are not supposed to serve. Women are not supposed to be in ministry. And so you will find that the few women who are called are considered as outcasts because the majority of the other women have taken that as church doctrine. And as long as this remains in the system as doctrine, you will always find the women who are the majority push for complacency. Now, my concern is that we need to push for a reconstruction of our theologies, because if we push for a reconstruction of our religious teachings, then we will begin to get rid of the pillars that make it appear that women are complacent. Why I'm saying this, occasionally I've heard men saying, women ministers, why are you talking? It is your sisters who turn you down. If you look at the population in the religious congregations, women are 90% in some of them, and they come and vote against the women, and they say the teachings have taught them so. So we have to reconstruct our religious teachings so that we put structures in place that can empower us when we have to talk about the rights of women to serve and to be in society. I just needed to say that.
Thank you, Mary. And you'll see in the chat that the speakers are agreeing with you as well. So Joan, over to you.
Hello, yes, I'm speaking from Japan, and from a Buddhist perspective, which may be a bit different. And I just thought I would share something that, you know, as someone who's experienced domestic violence and had to come to a decision as to what to do about it, based, you know, largely on my own faith practice. I think we have to recognize that every single woman who is in a situation like this is, you know, utilizing all her resources to survive and find the best way forward. And that she's in a very complex situation. So I find the word complicity actually really offensive. I mean, I know there are structures out there sometimes that do fail to deal with this, but I think we have to realize that for people who are experiencing this, the word implies that they don't know what's going on or they don't care, whereas I think there's often a very sophisticated understanding of what's going on and a very deep wish to find a way out of it. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a fault in the word itself. Lisa,
sorry, Olivia, if I
sorry.
can
Yeah, please.
briefly respond. Thank you, Joan, for that, for what you're highlighting with that, I guess. So in a way, thank you for making me aware or pointing out the sensitivity of the term. I think in a way, when I wrote this, it was not necessarily the idea of women, specifically survivors or women experiencing violence. It was more in general religious women okaying with the system that subjugates them in different ways. But I'm truly loving, thank you for how you're pointing out this term and that I will use it more sensitively. Thank you.
Okay, we've got Mujan.
Yes, mine is a two-part question. I thank you very much for this presentation. It was very good, and I very much went along with it, where you were explaining the difference between the analytical and the political. What I query, however, is where that leaves you in terms of action, because it seems to me, I mean, in the paper, you gave a couple of examples of action emerging from this process, and one of them was to reinterpret the scriptures, to negotiate a new interpretation of the scriptures. But I wonder how successful that would be if you go along to a local priest or a local mullah and, you know, and try to persuade them of some interpretation that's totally against the traditional interpretation. I mean, tradition is so strong in these communities that you're going to come up against a brick wall, basically, in most 99% of cases. So that's my first part of my question. And the second part of my question is that by doing that, by approaching the religious leader, the male religious leader in a locality, are you not actually then reinforcing the patriarchy by your implicit acknowledgement that this is the person in charge, this is the person you need to go to, this is the person who can sort things out? You're actually reinforcing the patriarchy in that locality.
Such good questions and points that you're making. Thank you so much. There are many examples of programming that is engaging with sacred scripture. So reinterpreting the Bible or the Quran and engaging in that way. One of the key things that we're seeing is it needs to be long-term. So this isn't just walking up to, you know, the local priest and saying, wait, we need to understand Corinthians slightly differently now. It is a very long-term program, like Najah was talking about, channels of hope, that's actually within the same community. I've seen these scriptural reinterpretation programs that do that work in different communities, also with different faiths. So I think this is an avenue with much potential. It really does depend on how it's done, though, because I've evaluated programming where it's an outsider coming in saying, you've always read the Bible wrong, and this is how it's supposed to be read. And really facing rejection, whereas if it's local leaders, local authority in a long-term conversational process, it does show better success, I guess. So approaching the male leader, I think this is such a good point. And I think for those of us that work in a religious spaces, this is a constant tension that we face. Like, so you have to engage with the structures that exist, but engaging with the structures, what am I okay? So this is a constant tension. I do need to emphasize, though, that like processes like scriptural reinterpretation, it's not always going through the male religious leaders. I've been with programs and even organic programs, like not formal programming by the organizations, what I mean by that, where it started with small women's groups starting this process of reinterpreting. So I think you can disrupt that power hierarchy. And I think it shouldn't be an either or. I think it should go from both, because it's kind of the top-down, bottom-up effect. You need both. If you just go bottom-up, it very often gets squashed by the people at the top. But the same way, you know, if you just with the people at the top, you reinforce the hierarchy. So I just think the points that you make, Najah, this is the constant struggle, I think, of the space that we're working in. Like, to work in the space to without that engagement, okaying everything within that space. Yes, I hope that responds. Thank you.
Yeah, we're unfortunately at the end of our time, but these are very deep questions and discussions, and I know ones that we all talk about and have talked about over many years, with some of us working in this space, and JLI is very happy to be a host of continued discussions in this space as well. So thank you very, very much to Lisa and Najah. We're very appreciative of your time and your presentation and presentations and insights. As I said, we are taking a break in August for the summer, and then we will be back in September, and we'll be hearing from Nalika Gajawira on intersections of gender, nationalism and faith-based giving in Sri Lanka. There might be even an opportunity to continue some of the threads that we've started in this discussion. So thank you for everyone's time today. This recording will be on the website shortly as well. Okay, see you all later. Bye.